The Secret Ingredient. Chapter 1. What she left out. I found the recipe card tucked inside the old biscuit tin 3 weeks after my mother's funeral. Wedged between a folded prayer leaflet from the church and a birthday card I had sent her in 1997. The one with the cartoon cat wearing a party hat. I remember drawing a small arrow on the envelope, because I was 8 years old and convinced she might not know which end to open. She had kept it for 27 years. The biscuit tin was green, the kind that once held Danish butter cookies at Christmas. The kind every grandmother in the Northern Hemisphere seems to possess as a matter of biological necessity. My mother, Nora, had filled hers with the small debris of a life, stamps she would never use. A thimble, missing its twin, a lock of hair from my first haircut still tied with a white ribbon. And the recipe card. It was written in her hand, that particular cursive she'd learned at school in the 70s, looping and unhurried, each letter leaning gently to the right as though walking into a soft wind. The card itself was cream-colored and stained at the corner with something reddish that I chose to believe was tomato and not red wine, though knowing my mother, it was probably both. At the top, in her best handwriting, as if she'd taken her time, Nora's ribollita. For my Lily. Learn this and you'll never be lonely on a cold night. Lily. That's me. Lily Voss, 35 years old, recently relocated from Edinburgh back to the Cotswolds to sort through my dead mother's house, and, apparently, discover that she'd been running a small and very deliberate con on me for the better part of a decade. Because I had made this soup before. Many times. I had made it and it had never been right. Never quite reached the thing I was chasing. That particular depth of flavor. That warmth that sat in your chest like a second heartbeat. And now, reading the card slowly at her kitchen table with a mug of tea going cold beside me, I understood why. The recipe was missing a step. It wasn't subtle, the omission. If you didn't already know and I didn't, not then you'd never notice it. The card read perfectly well. A complete and sensible set of instructions for a Tuscan bread soup. Onions, celery, carrot, garlic, cannellini beans, cavolo nero. A Parmesan rind, which she had always told me was the most important thing, the thing that gave the broth its body. Day-old bread. Seasoned to taste. But there was no mention of the wine. Chapter 2. Sunday afternoons. My mother had a talent for soup the way some people have a talent for music or mathematics. It seemed to come from somewhere below thought, below effort. A kind of bodily knowledge that lived in her hands. She could walk into a kitchen with whatever happened to be in the vegetable drawer and produce something that made you feel the world was fundamentally decent. People talked about it. At the village fete, her ribollita had once caused a mild controversy when the Woman's Institute asked for the recipe, and she'd smiled and said she'd write it down for them. And then somehow never quite had. I grew up watching her cook on Sunday afternoons. The radio on always Radio 4, always some program about something deeply specific. The history of a particular cheese or the ecology of upland meadows. And her moving around the kitchen with an easy, unhurried confidence that I spent my whole childhood trying to absorb and somehow never managed. She'd let me stir. She'd let me tear the bread. But she would always, at a certain point, turn towards the stove and do something with her back to me. And I would lose the thread of the thing. I thought, for years, that it was simply the Parmesan rind. She had insisted on it. So vehemently, so often, that it became the detail I fixated on. I would source good Parmigiano Reggiano from the Italian deli 3 towns over. I would save the rinds carefully in a freezer bag, the way she'd taught me. And the soup would be good, genuinely good. The kind of good that people asked for seconds of, but it would not be hers. There's a particular grief in almost right. In the thing that is. So close to what you remember that the distance feels insulting. The first time I tried to make the ribollita on my own was the winter after I moved to Edinburgh. 23 years old and convinced that independence was something you performed, rather than something you felt. It was February. I had a flatmate named Freya who was doing a PhD in something that involved a great deal of sighing over medieval manuscripts. And she had come down with a cold that had turned her philosophical. I decided to make soup. I called my mother. "It's not right," I said, stirring something that was theoretically a ribollita but tasted principally of effort. "What did you do?" she said. And then, over the next 20 minutes, we went through it together, every step, every quantity. She asked questions. I answered them. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, the soup began, almost imperceptibly, to taste better. "You have to let it sit," she told me, finally. "It needs time. Come back to it in 10 minutes. I did. It was better. Not right, but better. Close enough. That evening, with the Edinburgh wind pressing against the window, and Freya wrapped in a blanket on the sofa, that I felt something warm settle into me. Something that was almost, but not quite, the feeling of being home. I called her about the soup for 12 years after that. Approximately. Chapter 3. The missing glass. I know when I discovered it, the missing step, because I wrote the date in the little notebook I keep in the kitchen, a habit from culinary school. The 1 year I spent in Bristol before I decided I preferred writing about food to making it professionally. November the 14th. 14 months ago, as it turns out, which means I discovered my mother's secret while she was still alive. And I never said anything, and now she is gone. And I cannot ask her whether she knew that I knew. It happened the way most accidental discoveries happen. I was distracted. My then boyfriend Leon had rung while I was cooking, which meant I was holding the phone between my ear and shoulder, half listening to his perfectly reasonable concerns about a holiday we were meant to be booking, while also having opened a bottle of Vermentina for myself that was sitting on the counter. At the point in the ribollita where the garlic has just gone in, and the kitchen smells like something ancient and good, my elbow nudged the wine glass. And I caught it just before it spilled. And then, not thinking, really, just reacting, I tipped what remained of the glass into the pan. About 150 milliliters. Maybe a little more. The kitchen changed. That is the only way I can describe it. The smell changed. Something lifted and deepened at the same time. The way a chord does when you add the right note, suddenly structural, suddenly complete. I stood very still, phone still pressed to my shoulder. Leon still talking, and I understood that I had done something irreversible and correct. The soup that evening was right. For the first time in 12 years, it tasted like my mother's kitchen. It tasted like Radio 4 and Sunday afternoons. And the sound of the garden gate clicking shut when my father came home. It tasted like being 8 years old. And certain that the world was comprehensible. I sat down at the table and cried a little, which Leon found confusing. And I didn't explain because I wasn't sure I could. How do you explain that soup can be a kind of time travel? That a flavor can be a door? I called my mother the next morning. I made the ribollita last night, I said. Oh yes? She said, in the voice she used when she was interested, but pretending not to be particularly. It was good, I said. Really good. Different. Different how? I don't know, I said, which was a lie. And she probably knew it was a lie, and we both let it stand there between us, comfortable and unhurried. Sometimes you just hit the right day, she said. The weather, your mood. Soup is very sensitive to who's making it. I think that's true, I said. And we talked about other things, the garden. A book she was reading, whether I thought Leon was serious about the holiday or just talking. She made me laugh 3 times before we hung up. She always made me laugh. It was one of the many things about her that I was absolutely certain would be true forever. Right up until it wasn't. What I did not say, on that phone call, or any subsequent one, was I know what you left out. I don't entirely know why. Partly, I think, because I wasn't entirely certain. Maybe it was the mood, the weather. The vermentina in my blood making everything taste warmer. Partly because naming it felt like catching her at something. And I didn't want her to feel caught. And partly this is the part I've only understood since she died, because I didn't want to lose the reason to call. Which means, I suppose, that I had become complicit in her con. I was keeping the question open on purpose too. We were both protecting the same thing from different ends. Chapter 4. Her particular genius. My mother was not, by most measures, a complicated woman. She was warm, and she was funny. And she was stubborn in the way of people who have been right enough times to have earned the right. She grew vegetables she called by their first names. She wrote letters by hand to people who had email, and they always wrote back. She had opinions about cloud formations and strong opinions about bread, and absolutely no interest in being argued out of either. She loved my father with a steadiness that was so complete it was almost invisible. Like good grammar. You only notice it when it's wrong. She was also, I came to understand, a strategist of the first order. Just a very quiet one. After I found the recipe card in the biscuit tin, I did what I always do when I am trying to understand something. I made a list. Not on paper, just in my head, lying in her bed that night because I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the guest room, and the smell of her pillowcase was still there. Faintly, like the last note of a song after the music has stopped. I thought about all the calls. 12 years of calls. Roughly, some more urgent than others. Some in proper distress. The February of my Edinburgh cold. The January I'd had a bad breakup and thought soup might help. Which it did. Moderately. Some almost ceremonial, a checking in disguised as a culinary question. How many times had I picked up the phone because the ribollita wasn't right? A dozen? 20? More? And each time, she had answered. Each time, she had walked me through it with patience and interest. As though we were solving something together. As though the answer might reveal itself this time if we were careful enough. She had never said, "You're probably forgetting the wine." She had never even mentioned wine in the context of the soup. She had redirected, suggested, inquired. She had extended the conversation for as long as it could reasonably go. She had wanted me to call. That sounds so simple, written plainly. She wanted me to call. But what I lay there understanding, in her bed, in her house, with the Cotswolds dark and quiet around me and her reading glasses folded on the nightstand, what I understood was the fullness of it. The particular genius of it. Because she had not made the thing too hard. She had not left out something obvious. Something I would stumble upon immediately and feel foolish about. She had left out something that could only be found by accident, by instinct, by a random Tuesday evening when a glass of wine tipped and a kitchen changed. Something you might never find. Something that gave her years. She had engineered a connection point. A standing excuse for me to need her. And I had used it. Not cynically. Never cynically. But I had used it. I had stood in Edinburgh kitchens and Bristol kitchens and the small galley kitchen of the flat I shared with Leon. And I had picked up the phone, and she had picked up. And for 20 minutes or half an hour. We had talked about soup and talked about everything else. And the world had been smaller and warmer and more manageable. And she, presumably, had put down the phone each time and been quietly pleased in the way that she was quietly pleased about most things. Not triumphant. Not smug. Just satisfied. Her particular way of satisfaction. A small exhale through the nose and a return to whatever she was doing. Her friend Stella, who had known her for 40 years, told me at the wake that Nora always knew what people needed before they did. She wouldn't tell you, mind, Stella said, holding her sherry and looking at the middle distance. She'd just quietly arrange for you to find it yourself. Drove some people mad, but you always got there. I thought about that a lot in the weeks after the funeral. The quiet arrangement, the invisible architecture of her care. I also thought about the things I hadn't said. The call I hadn't made in the last months when she was ill. And the calls were harder, when hearing her voice on the phone was also hearing what was different about it. What was slower, what was more tired. I had rationed the calls in those months, terrified of running out of them. Which meant I had used fewer of them than I should have. I had been saving something that was already nearly gone. This, I think, is the central mistake of love. We are always either spending it too freely or hoarding it too carefully, and the calibration is almost impossible. And we only see where we went wrong after the fact. In the dark. In someone else's bed. With their reading glasses folded on the nightstand. Chapter 5. What I add now. I made the ribollita for the first time after her death on a Saturday in late October, 2 months after the funeral. The house was sold by then. I'd spent September clearing it. A process that was both worse and more interesting than I'd expected. The way grief tends to be, and I was back in my flat in Bristol. Which felt unfamiliar to me in the way that home sometimes does after you've been away from it long enough to see it plainly. Smaller. Quieter. More mine than it had ever felt, which was also, somehow, lonelier. I had brought the biscuit tin with me. I had brought the recipe card. I set it on the counter and read it through once while I gathered the ingredients. Onions. Celery. Carrot. Garlic. Cannellini beans. A bunch of Cavolo Nero from the market, which had been the last market of the season. The stallholder rueful about it in the way of someone saying goodbye to something recurring. Parmesan rind from the freezer bag. Stock I'd made from a chicken carcass the week before, because I'd started doing that. Making stock. Saving rinds. Sometime in the last year. As though I were finally, at 35, beginning to cook the way she had always cooked, carefully, with an eye to the next thing. I opened a bottle of Vermentina. I poured a glass for myself. And then, at the right moment, I poured one for the pan. The kitchen changed, the way it always does. I have not gotten used to it. The way the smell lifts and deepens, the way the room becomes, briefly, somewhere else. Her somewhere else, specifically. The kitchen on the hill in the Cotswolds, Radio 4, the sound of the gate. The way she stood at the stove with her back to me and did the thing I couldn't see. I stood there for a moment with the empty glass in my hand and let myself be in it. Not trying to push through to the other side of it. Just standing in the middle of the feeling. Which is something she used to tell me. She had many small instructions for living that she delivered so casually you often didn't register them as instructions at all. Don't rush the difficult parts, she used to say, about soup and, implicitly, about everything else. Let it collapse into itself. That's how you get the depth. I sat down at the table to wait for it. I had brought the biscuit tin into the kitchen and it sat across from me, green and a little battered, the lid slightly ajar. I hadn't gone through everything in it yet. There was the thimble. The stamps. The lock of hair in white ribbon, which I could not decide what to do with and so had left in the tin for now, which felt like the right place for it. And there was the birthday card with the cartoon cat. The one I'd sent in 1997 with the arrow on the envelope. I'd looked at it again that morning. Inside, in the wobbly oversized printing of an 8-year-old. Happy birthday, Mummy. I love you very much. Love, Lily. P.S. You are the best soup maker in the world and also in space. She had kept it for 27 years in a biscuit tin with her thimble and her stamps. She had kept it the way she kept everything that mattered to her, quietly, where no one could see, where she could reach it easily. The soup was ready. I could tell by the smell before I went to check that particular fullness. The point of readiness that she used to call when it sounds like it's thinking. A description I had never quite understood until I started listening for it and then suddenly understood perfectly. I tore a piece of sourdough into the bowl, ladled the soup over it, finished it with olive oil and a little chili. Sat back down. It was right. It was completely, entirely right. It was hers. I ate it alone, which is something she would have found melancholy and also acceptable. She was realistic about solitude. Having chosen to live in it herself for the 2 years after my father died, before she told us she was fine and she meant it. Soup is good company, she used to say. Better than most people at being quiet. After I finished, I washed the bowl. I dried it. I put the recipe card back in the biscuit tin, next to the birthday card with the cartoon cat. And then I did something that I had been circling for weeks. Something I'd thought about in the house in the Cotswolds and on the drive back to Bristol and in the small hours of a dozen nights since. I took out my phone and opened the Notes app, and I wrote down the recipe. The complete recipe. All of it, including the wine, a good dry white, a generous pour, added after the garlic, before the beans and stock. Let it bubble and reduce for 2 minutes. Let it do what it does to the room. I don't have a daughter. I don't have anyone, at present, to write recipes for. But I find I've become someone who writes things down, these days. Who keeps things, as she kept things. In case. I find I've become someone who writes things down these days. Who keeps things, as she kept things. In case. What I keep thinking about. What I can't quite leave alone is whether she knew, whether she intended it fully from the beginning. Whether she sat down with that cream-colored card and her looping cursive and made the decision deliberately, I will leave out the wine. Whether she pictured me in future kitchens, puzzled and reaching for the phone. Whether she thought this will give me years. I think she did. I think she knew exactly what she was doing. Because she always knew what people needed before they did. And what she knew about me, what she had perhaps always known about me, was that I was the kind of person who would not call without a reason, who needed an excuse, who would let weeks go by in the comfortable busyness of a life and then surface suddenly on a Tuesday evening, stirring soup and wondering why it wasn't right. She gave me the reason. She wrapped it in a recipe card and left it for me to find, knowing I would find it only when I needed it, knowing I would need it regularly, knowing that each time I called, she would have 20 minutes or half an hour of me, undistracted, in her kitchen and mine simultaneously, talking about soup and talking about everything else. It was, I think, the most generous thing she ever did. It was also, technically, a deception. It was also, and this is the part one keep coming back to, the part that makes me put the phone down and stare at the ceiling. With something that is not quite grief and not quite gratitude but lives in the territory between them. It was also exactly right. She knew something about love that I am still learning, that it sometimes has to be structural. That you have to build the bridges before people know they need to cross them. That some distances only close when there's a reason, and the reason doesn't always have to be real, it just has to work. The wine works. I have confirmed this now, in my own kitchen, alone. With her recipe card in the biscuit tin and her reading glasses presumably still somewhere in a box I haven't opened yet. It works every time. The kitchen changes. The room becomes somewhere else, briefly a somewhere else that I carry around with me now, that I can access on a gray Tuesday in Bristol when I most need it. Which is, I think, the other thing she left out of the recipe. The thing you can't write on a card. The thing you find by accident, in the dark, on an ordinary evening, when you're not looking for it. She's still here, in the changed kitchen. In the right soup. In the way I stand at the stove now, at a certain point in the process, with my back to the room, and do the thing that makes the difference. I know now what she was doing, all those years. I know now what I was doing too, every time I picked up the phone. We were both just making sure the other one was still there.